Welcome, I'm Rose Aguilar, and this is your call. The election is in just 2 months. Ballots will be sent out to some states starting this Friday. You can still register to vote at vote.org. And if you're already registered, be sure to check your registration. And be sure to tell friends and family in Republican-controlled states where there are attempts to throw people off of the rolls. You can check your registration at vote.org. Today, we are beginning a series of shows about what is at stake in the election. And we're kicking it off with David Neiwert. David's a journalist who has spent many years covering extremist groups in the U.S. He is the author of The Age of Insurrection, The Ongoing War on American Democracy. Hi, David. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Always a pleasure.
Well, great to have you, David. I want to start out by asking you this question. It seems like the second half of last year, we saw a lot of articles and conversations about what is at stake in the election. A lot of people focused on the big picture, and it seems like we're not having those conversations as much right now. So what are your thoughts, given all of the reporting you've done on Trump and extremist groups, January 6th? What is at stake in 2 months?
Well, as I've said many times and state quite clearly in the book, democracy itself is at stake in this election, not just in the United States, but around the world, because the U.S. has always been the main progenitor of democracy around the world. And if democracy is overtaken by autocracy here, I think that it's going to have a global effect. But let's just think about what a nightmare an authoritarian government in the United States would be. It would end our long tradition of democratic rule. It would put millions of people under the thumb of people who have no respect for anybody who is less than an elite. And, I think it's, the civil society that we've kind of come to take for granted over the last 100 years or so is going to vanish. So I don't think people are prepared for that. And yet it can happen because it happens in democracies around the world all the time. Democracies do fail and they are overtaken by autocracies. I mean, just look in recent years in Hungary and in Turkey, and see what's happened there. People don't have democratic rule anymore. And once you lose democracy, it's really hard to get it back. It's pretty much impossible.
What do you think of media coverage of these issues, David? Like I said, there were a lot of stories. Here's one from the New York Times in December: why a second Trump presidency may be more radical than his first. Donald Trump has long exhibited authoritarian impulses, but his policy operation is now more sophisticated, and the buffers to check him are weaker. So there were quite a few articles like this late last year, mid last year. But what do you think about now that we're 2 months away from the election? Joe Biden is not running anymore. So many things have changed with Kamala Harris running for president. What do you think about these bigger picture questions and the attention they are or are not getting in the major media?
Yeah, well, some of it is, just the nature of the news business. I do think that a lot of people in charge in responsible positions in the news media, the ones who are making the calls on what stories get covered and what stories don't, what freelancers they're hiring and which ones they're not, are deliberately choosing to try to, ask questions about, Kamala Harris's identity and all these side issues that have nothing to do with the issue of rescuing democracy from oncoming autocracy. And I think that a lot of these people think that those questions are boring because they already addressed them a year ago. So let's move on to something new, right? I mean, that's the nature of the news biz, to always come up with the new angle, the fresh new angle. And Let's just ignore the persistent, and that's the thing, is that this is a persistent problem. It's not going away. It didn't go away just because we asked the questions and just because the issue had been raised. I mean, we've known this since at least January 6th of 2021, that this is a problem, a serious problem that needs to be addressed. And yet we've done a really mediocre job of addressing it. We've had 1,000 prosecutions in the January 6th capital cases. But there's been very little that's been done to address the underlying issues, particularly the spread of extremism into the ranks of the military, as well as into the ranks of law enforcement, which were all raised on January 6th. And there was, a brief spate of about 2 months where we paid attention to it, and then it went away. And it's one of the really sort of disappointing aspects of the Biden administration, frankly, that they've done a poor job of holding the feet to the fire and pursuing these cases and pursuing the issue beyond that initial push. And so I think there's a lot of concern that, I mean, honestly, we're just kind of like sleepwalking towards this disaster. And, I'm concerned. I mean, a lot of people should be.
You retweeted a tweet from Gerald Holt yesterday. He's a senior researcher studying U.S. hate, and he wrote, "Is it just me, or has reporting on political extremism slowed to a trickle? A few great reporters are still going for it, but it seems like a lot of publications have pulled on it. Also, it could be a side effect on this site being, I'll just say, crappy for news anymore." And then Taylor Lorenz, who writes about this, wrote, "I feel like the beat has been systematically dismantled by people in power and media organizations deciding to feed into extremist hate campaigns rather than cover them critically." A lot of other independent journalists weighed in on this. It's pretty interesting to see what people are talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, my favorite response was from Amanda Moore, who I have talked with periodically, responding to Jared's post. She put up a quote from one of her rejections. Amanda Moore is a terrific independent reporter who's gone undercover with some of these, neo-Nazis, white nationalist groups showing up as they mix and mingle with Republican operatives. And here's what the rejection read. "In the 3 years since January 6th, everyone knows there are neo-Nazis in the Republican Party, and no one cares anymore. It won't move." This is the rejection she got on her undercover story. She actually wound up doing the story, and it wound up being the fifth most read article on The Nation last year. So, but that's typical of what people in this line of work. I mean, honestly, I've been dealing with those kinds of rejections for roughly 20 years. And you just got to keep moving. But
can we repeat this?
This is fairly typical.
So this is Amanda. This is Amanda Moore, who goes undercover in these groups, and she tweeted that she got a rejection from a national media outlet last year about her reporting. And she writes, this is what the media outlet told her: "In the 3 years since January 6th, everyone knows there are neo-Nazis in the Republican Party and no one cares anymore. It won't move."
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, this is the sophisticated, savvy political insider view of how we deal with neo-Nazis.
Really incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I see. It's not news anymore. So, the only thing they care about is what's new, right? But this is an old story, but it's persistent. It hasn't gone away, and there should be concern about that. But instead, let's just move on. This is an old hat, and it won't be an issue. And I'm afraid that come post-election season this year, it's going to be an issue.
David Neiwert is a journalist covering right-wing extremism. His latest book is called The Age of Insurrection, The Ongoing War on American Democracy. We are starting a series of shows about what is at stake in this upcoming election. It's just 2 months away. And we're going to ask, what is at stake? So let's play a clip. This is Donald Trump laying out his authoritarian agenda. And thanks to the Washington Post for this compilation.
Where there is a true and total breakdown of law and order, then the federal government can and should send the National Guard to restore order and secure the peace without having to wait for the approval of some governor. In 2016, I declared, I am your voice. Today I add, I am your warrior, I am your justice. And for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. I will immediately reissue my 2020 executive order restoring the president's authority to remove rogue bureaucrats, and I will wield that power very aggressively. On day one of my new administration, I will direct the DOJ to investigate every radical DA and Attorney General in America for their illegal, racist, in-reverse enforcement of the law. We're going to do an executive order day one, so important, ending automatic citizenship for children of illegal aliens. I will do everything I can to challenge the Impoundment Control Act in court and, if necessary, get Congress to overturn it. We will overturn it. We will carry out the largest domestic deportation operation in American history. I will invoke the Alien Enemies Act to remove all known and suspected gang members, drug dealers, or cartel members from the United States.
And if you're president again, will you lock people up?
The answer is you have no choice because they're doing it to us.
That is Donald Trump laying out his authoritarian agenda. Thanks to the Washington Post for that compilation. One thing I wanted to add to that is right around 2020, after George Floyd was murdered, a former Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, said Trump inquired about shooting protesters during those protests, during that uprising. So Mark Esper said Trump asked about shooting protesters. So this is serious stuff, David. Why isn't this? I mean, yes, it does get attention. But for example, the debate is next week, 6 o'clock next Tuesday. David Muir and Lindsay, let me make sure I have their names right. David Muir and Lindsay Davis from ABC are going to moderate that debate. Will they be asking questions about this?
I'm afraid they're probably not going to be. I mean, certainly if I were one of the questioners, the first thing I would ask them about is the, planned mass deportation program, because I don't think people have any understanding what that's going to look like. It's basically going to be a police state descending on the United States as people start reporting on each other. We'll see vigilante action, assisting in the roundups. We're going to see lots of citizens deported alongside the supposed illegal, what they call illegal aliens. And that's just the first part of the nightmare, because once they're done with the immigrants, they're just getting started. It's going to be whoever their next victims are, their next targets. We've already seen them certainly talk about the LGBTQ community in that regard. They want to start rounding up so-called groomers, which would probably be anybody who's a drag queen or transgender, and similar acts. The immigrants are just the start. But he's talked about he says, I want to be day one dictator. And he, hilariously, his fans seem to think, he's only going to do it on that first day, right? But no dictator ever relinquishes power after a single day. And indeed, he says he's going to be a dictator for two things. When he's going to close the border, and the other is that, let's see, what was the other issue? At any rate, closing the border is not something that you can just do in one day. It's not something. It means he's going to have to maintain those dictatorial powers well beyond, even the first year that he's in office. So, these notions that, he's just talking over the top and things like that. Well, we have Project 2025 to tell us that he actually has concrete plans in place to do this. And it's not just the plans don't just involve rounding up undocumented immigrants. It's going to involve, it also involves firing the entire Department of Justice and replacing it with his toadies, firing hundreds, if not thousands, of civil servants, probably thousands of civil servants throughout the United States, and replacing them with his toadies. So it's going to be a disaster. And should we mention the economic disaster that rounding up all of these immigrants is going to cause? I mean, are you ready to pay $20 for tomato because nobody's going to be able to go out and harvest these things? Of course, maybe that's one of the reasons they are all in favor of reviving child labor again. Who knows?
Well, to your point, Time Magazine did an in-depth interview with Trump on April 12th, and they went into more detail about this plan than anyone else, based on what I've read. And so Trump told them that the deportation plan would involve using local law enforcement, and then he says the military, generally speaking, but the National Guard's what he's talking about. And then he said this would not involve using camps. I've heard a lot about camps. He said that's not going to be the case because we're not, quote, we're not leaving them in the country. We're bringing them out. And so Time said, right, are you ruling out building detention camps? He said, I wouldn't rule out anything, but there wouldn't be much of a need for that because of the fact that we're going to be moving them out. We're going to bring them back from where they came. And then he says, Stephen Miller said part of that would be camps. He said it's possible that we'll do it to an extent, but we shouldn't have to because we're moving them out as soon as we get to it. We'll be starting with the criminal element. We're going to use local police because they know them by first name, second name, and third name. I don't know what he means by that, but how are you going to get state and local police departments to participate? And he said, some will want to, some won't. So basically he's saying that they're going to basically push people out and fly people out. That is his plan.
Yeah. Miller's plan is to what they actually are planning and already have drawn plans up for is these sort of midway detention centers where they process everyone. But here's the problem. I mean, these guys, as we know from having watched them mishandle the COVID pandemic, these guys don't do logistics well. I wrote a book about the Japanese American internment, and that involved 128,000 people during World War II. And the logistics, the massive logistics of setting those, evacuating those people and getting them away from the coast and all that sort of thing was just a huge, massive undertaking that took an incredible amount of time. And the idea that you can do this with 11 to 20 million people in a short amount of time and it won't require extended detention and processing centers is just a delusion. Obviously, it's going to take, if they're going to deport that many people, and just to process them, it's going to take, a tremendous amount of time. And especially if they're not going to be able to immediately figure out where they're going to be sending these people back to. A lot of the undocumented immigrants come from places that they don't even know. Right.
Let's play another clip. This is Stephen Miller speaking to CPAC about how they will carry out this mass deportation plan.
So you grab illegal immigrants and then you move them to the staging grounds, and that's where the planes are waiting for federal law enforcement to then move those illegals home. You deputize the National Guard to carry out immigration enforcement, and then you also deploy the military to the southern border. The military has the right to establish a fortress position on the border and to say no one can cross here at all.
So that is Stephen Miller speaking at CPAC about how they'll carry out this mass deportation plan. And at the Republican convention a couple of weeks ago, we saw so many people holding signs while cheering that said mass deportation now.
Right.
So
Yeah,
that,
no, it's
yeah, go
just
ahead, David.
they're not hiding it, that's for sure. Yeah, no, and they think that people actually want this. And there are some people who actually do want this. So, one of the reasons we have a rise in authoritarian is that there are people with authoritarian personalities. That's the reason we have a rise in authoritarianism, excuse me, and is that there are people with authoritarian personalities who prefer an authoritarian government and would prefer to have a dictator rounding up these illegal immigrants. Let's not fool ourselves about this. Plenty of our fellow Americans actually do support this. But the problem is that, of course, they are in a minority. And I think once your average American starts getting a sense of what this actually looks like in action, they will be appalled because it's essentially a police state. And it's going to be an economic disaster as well.
Today, we're speaking with journalist David Neiwert, who's been covering extremist groups in the U.S. for many years. His latest book is called The Age of Insurrection: The Ongoing War on American Democracy. The election is in just 2 months. Ballots will be sent out to some states starting on Friday. If you have not registered to vote, you can do so at vote.org. Be sure to check your registration. We're going to do a lot of shows about this also in the coming weeks. In many Republican-controlled states, there are attempts to throw people off of the rolls. So be sure to check your registration. And then this morning on NPR, the United States Postal Service is sending out a public service announcement saying to vote as early as possible. If you're going to vote by mail, to vote as early as possible to make sure that your vote is counted. Another thing that Republicans are trying to do is to ensure that ballots that are received after the election, even if they are postmarked on the election day, will not be counted. So just be sure to vote in advance to make sure that your ballot is postmarked so it will be counted. There's all kinds of things happening here, David. We need to get the word out about making sure that you're on the rolls, making sure that your vote is counted.
Right.
Before we go to break, I want to ask you a couple questions. I'll ask you the first one before we go to break. What do you think will happen if Kamala Harris wins, but by not that many votes? So let's say it's 5,000 in Georgia, 10,000 in Pennsylvania. What do you think Trump will do based on the lawsuits that have been filed and what you're hearing from him and the people he's surrounding himself with?
Well, they actually have a plan in place to try to throw the election into the Congress and have the state legislatures actually decide who their slates of electors are. And since the states are talking about are all Republican owned, that would result in a Trump victory. I think that this is certainly the post-election period is going to be very fraught, particularly in some of these battleground states where the vote is probably going to be very close. And as we saw in 2020, they turned out mobs of people outside these voting centers who were threatening them and demanding, the ballots be hand counted or whatever, and decrying the results that were coming out, in particular in places like Arizona and Georgia. I think it's going to look even more like January 6th type of mob action when this time around. I think that there are going to be attempts to disrupt the voting. I think there may be acts of domestic terrorism, possibly. Some of these voting centers could get bombed or attacked by groups of militiamen, and at which point, they can just say all bets are off. We're going to throw this to the Congress, and because we can't actually determine what the real results are in these states because we're not able to get a complete vote. So yeah, I think that we need to be prepared for this and need to make sure that the ballot counting its process itself is absolutely secure and safe from these kinds of external threats, because I think that they're going to try to make those threats come true.
I'm guessing that a lot of people did a double take when you said that there could possibly be some bombings. What is that based on?
It's some of it's based on my knowledge of how right-wing domestic terrorists act, dating back to um, Oklahoma City. And that method of disruption has not gone away. It's just not been actively deployed a lot. But there was an attempt in 2016 to there was a group of men in Kansas who were plotting to set off a truck bomb in a Muslim community, as a way of, because they actually anticipated that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And so their first act against the Clinton administration was going to be this attack on a Muslim community in Kansas. And it was going to be, a McVeigh style truck bomb, only I think they were planning to have 3 of them. So that's it's based on how I know what their modes of operation are. But also, I think the biggest thing is that there are these platforms, these chat rooms, Telegram, and places like that where these guys go and have their conversations and get organized. And I monitor those, and I get to see the conversations they have among themselves, and they're all, they're incredibly eager to not just make sure the vote goes their way and are willing to use violence to do it, but they're also eager to start a civil war, what they keep calling a civil war. They've been fantasizing about civil war since at least 2020. And actually for a lot longer than that. But the fantasies have become intensified over the last 4 or 5 years. And that civil war involves militia organized attacks on government bodies. It involves domestic terrorist attacks of various kinds. And it involves just getting out their AR-15s and their multitudes of ammunition from their basement and making use of them against their neighbors.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. Today, we're joined by journalist David Neiwert. He has spent many years covering extremist groups in the United States. He monitors their activity and conversations online, and he's the author of The Age of Insurrection, the ongoing war on American democracy. On today's Your Call, we begin a series of shows talking about what is at stake in the upcoming election, which is in just 2 months from today. If you'd like to join us, the toll-free number is 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. We'll be back after this. This is Your Call. I'm Rose Aguilar. Coming up tomorrow, we will continue our series on Project 2025 by talking more about what it means for the people. You can find all of our past Project 2025 shows at kalw.org. Click on News and then Your Call. If you have a show idea or a guest idea, or you'd like to weigh in on how you'd like us to cover the upcoming election, we'd love to hear from you. Email your call at kalw.org. Today, we begin a series about what is at stake in the upcoming election. It's just in 2 months from today. Be sure to check your registration. You can do it at vote.org. You can also register to vote there. Today, we're joined by David Neiwert. He's spent many years covering extremist groups in the U.S. He's the author of The Age of Insurrection, the ongoing war on American democracy. You can join us at 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. I want to play a clip from Stephen Levitsky, who is the author of a great book called Tyranny of the Minority. And he's been on the show a few times talking about how multiracial democracy is at stake. He talks a lot about how the Republican Party can no longer win with just the white vote. And so that is why they are going to great lengths to suppress the vote, gerrymander, and all of the other things that we talk about on the show. And he says that is really what's at stake here, whether this country truly becomes a multiracial democracy. Here is Stephen Levitsky speaking at the University of Notre Dame in December about the Republican Party embracing violence.
They've embraced individuals, for example, who threatened or killed Black Lives Matter protesters. The McCloskeys, remember the McCloskeys? The St. Louis couple that drew their guns on unarmed protesters? Were given a prominent speaking role in the Republican convention. Marjorie Taylor Greene nominated Kyle Rittenhouse. Remember Kyle Rittenhouse? Nominated him for a congressional gold medal. And during the 2022 primary season, the New York Times found more than 100 Republican ads in which candidates brandished or fired guns. I can think of no other major political party in any established democracy in which candidates so openly embraced violence. But the most dangerous feature of the contemporary Republican Party is its pervasive semi-loyalty. Republican leaders knew that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, and most of them in private were deeply troubled by his effort to overturn the result. But they enabled it anyway. They protected Trump by refusing to impeach and convict him. They blocked creation of an independent commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection, and nearly all of them say they will back Trump in 2024, even if he's convicted of trying to overturn an election.
That is Stephen Levitsky, author of Tyranny of the Minority, and we will have him on the show soon. David, I've heard Stephen in many talks talk about what an outlier the United States is, that it has members of a major party, the Republican Party, putting their entire family in Christmas cards holding guns. And then so many of them have guns in their ads. They're either shooting up a sign that says socialism or shooting up the Green New Deal. He says this is just pretty shocking. But what are your thoughts on this? Do you think people have gotten used to this, or people don't know it doesn't happen in other countries? What's your read on that?
Well, yeah, all of the above. I don't think I think Americans have gotten habituated to it, have been trained to see this as ordinary because it happens so often. And these sorts of things are just treated with a shrug by the media. Nobody raises any kind of outrage over people holding 50 caliber automatic automatic rifles or long range rifles to be able to for their Christmas cards. Merry Christmas before I kill you. I don't know what's going on there, but and of course what they're doing is the whole brandishing thing is all about establishing their sort of authoritarian cred, their macho-ness, their ability to frighten and intimidate their opponents. And they intend to hold minoritarian rule, as Stephen says. Their whole point of minoritarian rule is to threaten anybody who dares to upset their apple cart. And that's the whole point of the guns. And of course, this is all descended from, this is descended from the Civil War, when in the post-Civil War period, when Jim Crow and other racist institutions were installed in the South, under the weight of a real campaign of actual terrorism against Black voters and any white people who might help those Black voters. It was a terror campaign that ran for about 10 years, and it was built around lynching and mob rule and lots of gunfire. And that's what it dates back to. But there's definitely an intent to, as you say, they understand that they can't hold on to power in a multiracial democracy, and so they're doing their best to destroy the foundations of that multiracial democracy, which, the foundations are civility and common decency and a sense of fairness and equity. They don't care about that stuff. They think that stuff is sort of for suckers. And I think they're profoundly and deeply un-American because of it.
Stephen Levitsky also talks about how the Republican Party is really going along with this. And in your book, you write that there was a brief moment in the days immediately following the insurrection on January 6th when there was an opportunity for Republicans to really step in and stop this. Instead, within a matter of days, they regressed into what you call the cultish authoritarianism of Trumpism, refusing his impeachment and dismissing the insurrection as a mere protest that had, quote, gotten out of hand. Another thing that doesn't come up as much as it should, David, is that we've had a lot of journalists on who say a lot of Republicans behind closed doors, they're not happy with this. They do not want Trump to be in power, but they're afraid because his supporters are so violent and they have guns. Mm-hmm. And they see what happened to Republicans in many parts of the country, and they don't want that to happen to them.
Sure. I mean, they've seen what happened to Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, right? And those people were held up as examples of what happens if you try to stand up. And a lot of this, of course, has to do with the utter lack of spine and principle, and not to mention common decency and integrity on the part of leadership in the Congress, particularly Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, in the days after the insurrection, and their choice to try to cling to power rather than clean house, because that was the choice that they had. They either could cling to power by hanging on to Trump and defending him, or whatever power they had, or they could clean house, get rid of these seditionists that are worked their way into the Republican Party, and return it to a sort of normalcy. I mean, the Republican Party today is not conservative. They call themselves conservative, but there is nothing conservative about what they're doing, about their agenda. These people are radicals, and they are extremists, and that's the opposite of and they want to totally upend 250 years of American democratic tradition, and that ain't conservative, folks.
Well, Liz Cheney, who is very conservative, she has said that voting for Trump could be the last vote you will ever cast. She also told NBC in December that Trump will never leave office if he is elected again. Today, we are spending the hour with David Neiwert, who has spent many years covering extremist groups in the U.S. His latest book is called The Age of Insurrection: The Ongoing War on American Democracy. Today, we're kicking off a series of shows about what is at stake in this election, which is in just 2 months. The ballots will begin going out this Friday. Be sure to check your voter registration. You can do it at vote.org. We've got a number of callers on the line and some emails. So let's take a few calls and then we'll get responses from David. Let's go to Greg in Palo Alto. Hi, Greg. Thanks for holding.
A number of items that I want to run by your guest. One, I wonder what he thinks the Army will do, if anything, if Trump gets elected and tries to pull what it seems like he's going to do. The other thing is, I think, and I'd also like to know what he thinks the DOJ could. I mean, it's only 2 months left. What could the DOJ do to make sure that in these states, these voting processes are held democratically, and they'd be transparent and accurate counts. And lastly, it just seems like there have been so many opportunities for the Democrats to try and address this. There are no Senate hearings on this issue. The Democrats seem to be asleep at the switch with regard to this, although you hear some people talking about it. But this should be something they ought to be screaming about. But it just has not had the attention, it seems to me, that it should have gotten.
Thank you so much, Greg. We'll get responses in just a minute. Let's go first to Casey in San Francisco. Hi, Casey. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Rose. How are you? I just loved your show. I'm going to comment on it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Listen, I was up last night, and I feel exactly like David and yourself. I'm concerned about it. I'm concerned for the African Americans, especially with this violence. And, and the skinheads, the neo-Nazi groups, they could just go out on the street and start shooting at black people. They could do anything at this point. One of the reasons that I want to make that comment is because I was up last night watching C-SPAN. It's gotten down to the point, Rose, where it is so covert now that there was a gentleman caller that called in, said that he had gotten a letter from his landlord. And he read the letter actually on the air, where the landlord was raising the rent or something like that. And then there was a P.S. note at the end of the letter that said, please cast your vote, as quickly as possible, because we must stamp out, the Democrats, blah, 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 blah. So actually, it was a Republican landlord that was sending these letters, I couldn't believe it, to all of the people in the building and almost asking them to vote for Trump. And this was in a rental letter with a P.S. caveat to it. So it's gotten really bad. It's gotten covert where landlords are sending their residents now, their clients, letters and asking them, to vote for Trump. And I just found that to be so covert. I couldn't believe it.
And where did you hear about this?
This is on C-SPAN last night, Rose.
Wow.
I was up. I couldn't believe it. I stood up and I said, what? The landlords are sending their residents letters, these Republican landlords. And this is how covert it is getting now. To the point of, if you're a Republican, make sure that you cast your vote for Donald Trump.
Well, thank you for the call. And Casey, your concerns about the black community, I hear what you're saying. You reminded me of these stories that I'm reading about these neo-Nazis rallying in Nashville for, quote, the Great White South.
Exactly. Well, they lost the South, so, they still have that possibly on their minds. And so this is a wonderful opportunity, to make the reclaim, back to the days of Dixie and all of that. Even though he says he's not racist, but, I was reading the papers of 2025, and it sounds pretty racist to me, and you and David are right. You go after the women, with the abortion, then you go after the next group. It's like what Martin King said. You go after one group, and then it's another group, and then who's next? The blacks, and anything to jump off at that point.
Well, thank you so much for calling in, Casey. We're going to look that up and see if we can find it. If you find an article, please email it to us, your call at kalw.org. Let's go next to Belle in Berkeley. Hi, Belle. Welcome to the show.
Hi, how's it going? I love your show.
Thank you.
To talk about guns in America is like talking about bread and butter in other countries. We are a country who sells most weapons in the whole wide world. It's going to come to whatever we do outside of the country is going to come to our country. So we shouldn't be surprised. The way we treat, what's going on in Gaza, thinking that it's not going to happen to us here is kind of ridiculous because we are a nation of guns. yes, the Republicans right now are flashing it because they're lobbyists. You know, they should. I love Robin Williams when he said, "Hey, they should wear vests with all their lobbyists send them money, like a tracksuit, so we can know who's paying them." Of course, Republicans are getting money from the lobbyists, so of course they're going to be boasting about weapons. Democrats, they get money from the lobbyists too. They just don't boast about it. It's just really sad. And how come we're not talking about Jill Stein? Like, Jill Stein gets no representation in the media right now.
Well, thank you for that. We're going to do a show about third-party candidates, RFK joining Trump's team. There's lots of moving parts there. We're definitely going to do shows about that. So thank you for calling in. And we're definitely going to do shows about guns. I remember the Washington Post reported after that horrific massacre at that concert in Las Vegas, Donald Trump actually wanted to ban assault rifles, but his people told him that was political suicide. It didn't really get that much traction, but the Washington Post did report that. So thank you for calling in, Belle. A couple emails that we want to read before we get responses from David. Carol writes, if there are as many disruptions as your guest is possibly predicting, especially if the election results are close, wouldn't there be something that Biden could do to intervene, an executive action he could take using the powers that SCOTUS has given to the president? So she's talking about the immunity powers. And then Leslie writes in, can it be that so many people feel overloaded with information and short on time that some are drawn to Trump's style of authoritarianism just because he gives simple answers and tells them what they want to hear? So, David, there's lots of questions there.
Yeah, sure.
Why don't you take Leslie and Carol's question first?
You mean the one about
people feeling overwhelmed, and they might be drawn to him because he gives these simple answers.
Well, yeah, that's how authoritarianism works. It always promises the moon to people. It says, they say, oh, we'll make you more secure. We'll make your life better. Only I can solve this. Only I can solve these intractable problems. And it's sort of built around the whole myth of, Hercules cutting the Gordian knot with a single blow. And it has a lot to do with their worship of heroes. It's all built around hero worship. And it's one of the reasons why Trump is so insistent and constantly talks about why people should see him as their hero and as their savior. I'm going to be your retribution. This is classic authoritarianism, and this is how it works because it appeals to people. And, it's basically the choice that we get to make in society is between democratic rule, where we trust each other and make compromises with each other and listen to each other and have a discourse, or one where we just have one guy in charge and he gets to make all the decisions, because that's kind of the binary choice we're being handed. And I do think that, we've gotten accustomed to seeing democracy just keep going on and not get displaced. And we've assumed that it's just going to naturally defend itself. And the truth is, democracy has to always be defended because there are always people trying to dismantle it.
And David, I hate to cut you off, but we only have about 2 minutes left, and I want to make sure you can address the other questions. These are connected. Greg says, what will the Army do, if anything? What could the DOJ do? And then, do you agree with him that Democrats have mostly been asleep at the switch? What are they doing to deal with this?
Yeah, I think it's been a mixed bag as far as Democratic response to it. The January 6th prosecution was the most complex prosecution in American history, and DOJ did a terrific job with that. They got incredible conviction rate. But they've been asleep at the wheel when it comes to rooting extremists out of the military and rooting extremists out of law enforcement. And in actually coming up with a program to effectively counter anti-democratic forces that are out there in the country. I mean, one of the things that we talk about democracy and defending democracy, but what we don't actually do is how do we counteract these specifically anti-democratic forces, such as these neo-fascists like the Patriot Front and the Proud Boys and people like that. How do we actually, do we come up with a program to defang these groups and confront them in the streets, and in cases where they break the law, put them in jail, hold them accountable for their actions, for their criminality. And so, yeah, we get, it's, and honestly, people do get overwhelmed. And I think that, I'm not immune to the sort of dismay and depression that results from having to deal with all this stuff. But I do think that at the end of the day, people need to understand that that's their strategy. That's what they want you to do. They want you to feel disempowered, to feel discouraged, to get depressed, and to lose your energy. And all I can say to folks is we desperately need to find our strength to keep fighting. We desperately need to understand that we're at a really crucial fork in the road of American democracy. And they need to show up. They need to show up in large numbers. We need to make it overwhelming that this sort of attack on democracy will not stand, that Americans will not tolerate it, and that anyone who advocates it and promotes it and leads us down this path is going to become a pariah in American politics. I think that's the only way we can actually survive this. So, and I believe we will, but I think, now's the time to be talking about it, and now's the time to be getting ready. I do think there are things that the federal government can do. Besides some of these things, and particularly they need to be sending out alerts and preparing people in ballot counting centers to be able to defend themselves from.
Well, and David, we're out of time, but we're definitely going to do shows about that. David Neiwert is a journalist covering right-wing extremism and author of The Age of Insurrection, The Ongoing War on American Democracy. Thank you so much for your work, and thank you for joining us, David.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for your phone calls and emails, and thank you for joining us. I'm Rose Aguilar. It's your call.